Hello and welcome to another episode of the How to Create VR tutorial series, where you learn by watching other VR, AR, and MR professionals create the magic. I'm Marcelo Lewin, an immersive technologies evangelist, creator, producer, and the guy behind howtocreatevr.com. My guest creator today is John Bucher, a writer, story consultant, and author of 5 books, including the best-selling book, Storytelling for Virtual Reality. Disruptor named him one of the top 20 VR influencers to follow in 2018. Today, John will give us a bunch of tips and techniques for writing for VR experiences. But before we get started, I want to remind you to register to our site for free at howtocreatevr.com. Free registration gets you access to more video tutorials, assets to practice with, podcast interviews, ability to favorite, comment, create watch lists, and much more. It's really quick and easy. Just visit howtocreatevr.com and click on the Register for Free button. All right, John, welcome to the tutorial series.
It's really good to be here. Thanks for having me.
This is your second time with me. We did a podcast on writing tips, which was really cool.
I really enjoyed being a part of that. That was one of my favorite conversations I've had in recent days about VR.
Oh, that's nice to hear. Same here. Today, we're going to dig in deeper. The conversation we had on the podcast was a little bit bigger picture. Here, we're going to get into like nitty-gritty of writing for VR experiences.
Yeah, I really enjoy getting into the nuts and bolts of how to make these things work. I think we can talk, big theory all day, but we really have to get into how to apply these techniques and how to apply these theories firsthand if we're really going to understand how they work.
Definitely. Before we jump in, why don't you give us a quick background for those that haven't listened to the podcast? And if you haven't listened to the podcast, just look for, I believe it's episode 37, if I'm not mistaken, but it's the latest episode that I have as of today. Check it out and you can hear John there with a lot of great information. But give us some background again for those that are just watching the tutorial.
Absolutely. I've spent the last decade in Hollywood, California, working in the film and television industry, primarily in storytelling and writing, but I've always had a deep interest in technology and have kept a foot in that world as well. I was very interested in virtual reality in what some would consider the first serious wave of VR back even in the 80s, and have always kept an eye on it. When I first got a chance to play with the DK1 when Oculus released that, I really felt like that was a game changer. Things are going to really take off for VR in this wave. And so I began to look more deeply into how we tell stories in this new emerging medium. And I decided to go to the best storytellers working in the medium out there. And I began to interview them and eventually compiled a lot of those interviews along with my own research into a book called Storytelling for Virtual Reality that was released this last year and has sold very well and has at least brought about a lot of conversation in the VR community about how we tell effective stories that resonate with audiences with this new language and medium that we have.
Very cool. Well, I'm going to let you get started and I'll jump in if I have questions.
Thanks so much. As I said before, I'm very interested in how we tell stories with this emerging medium. I feel like that we have only found success with a new technology once we've learned how to tell a story with it. And I would even argue that most technologies have not reached a critical mass until we've learned to tell a story with that medium. So when we look at film, television, radio, even the internet, it's really not until we were able to figure out how to tell a compelling story with that medium did the general public embrace it on a large scale. I believe we're in the early days of that with virtual reality. We want things to happen very quickly. We want the public to adopt it en masse. But we have to remember how long it took us to figure out how to tell stories in film and television, these other mediums. And so I think we have to give ourselves a little bit more time, a little bit more grace, and a little bit of time to really experiment with the medium before we can begin to truly develop a new language to tell stories in this medium, which leads me to the first tip that I'd like to present to you. I believe that with virtual reality, because it is such a new medium, that experimentation is essential. Now, when I say that, I think many of us are going to lean into the mediums that we are familiar with in the traditional media. But I believe we have to recognize that VR is a unique medium with a different language than our traditional media. VR is not just a combination of film and video games where we take those ideas that we've learned about those mediums and those rules and apply them to VR, and then it works perfectly. This is a new medium with its own distinct language, and I think we have to honor that. We have to play around with the medium before we're going to figure out how we truly can tell stories in it.
Quick question for you, specifically to the language itself of the medium. Part of the problem right now is that there is no specific language of immersive or cinematic VR like we have of filmmaking, right? Filmmaking has its own language. It's been established for, 100 years?
Yes.
With VR, obviously, you don't have that language yet. Do you think that's an issue right now, or that actually opens it up to your first tip, which is, since we don't have a language, we're able to experiment and figure things out as we go?
That's exactly how I feel, that because we don't yet have a language, we can experiment. I think when you look at how languages develop, first sounds are developed, and then words are developed, and then we start to figure out how to put words into sentences and then develop more complex thoughts through paragraphs before we get up to novels. I think we're at the point where we've figured out many of the words to use in VR. We know many of the sentences that we can put together, but I don't think we've yet figured out how to combine words and sentences to communicate a complex idea. So I think this is a really exciting time. How many chances do we get in a lifetime to help define the language for a new medium? I think this is a really exciting moment for all VR creators. And I do think we can look to other mediums to find nuggets that we can pull out, elements of film, video games, immersive theater. These are mediums that I think we can learn from. They've been around much longer than VR. They have principles that they have figured out a language in order to execute. But we do have to keep in mind that writing for VR, it's different than any of these. We are going to have to try things that may fail. And I think this is very difficult in our culture to put ourselves out there and share things that may not work. But this is the only way that we're going to find this language. Is I'm not going to find it on my own. I'm only going to find it by seeing what you do and building on that, seeing what someone else does and building on that. So I'm really excited about how open the virtual reality community has been at this point with sharing their work with others. It seems to me, and I'd be curious if you feel the same way, that most VR creators have created their work with a very open hand, saying, tell me what you think. Tell me what works, what doesn't work. And I feel like there's a very good energy within the VR community to try and figure out this language together, that no one is really feeling like it's solely their responsibility.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. The reason I was asking that is because a lot of filmmakers are trying to make the migration into VR itself, and they're kind of doing TV and film in VR when, like you said, we should be using VR for that medium and making it a VR experience, not a TV inside of VR.
I do think one of the things that we can go back to that predates film, television, any of the other mediums we work with is what we know about theories of human communication. And one of the very first things that you learn if you take any sort of communications course or program is you learn to identify your audience and the purpose of what you're creating. So I think this is something very important for VR creators, is to actually identify who is my audience and what is the purpose of this piece I'm creating. Typically, with human communication, we categorize these things into three categories. We create things that are meant to entertain. They are simply meant to bring joy or thought or move someone emotionally, but entertainment is purely their purpose. The second category is persuasion. Are we trying to persuade someone to feel a certain way? Are we trying to educate someone to action about something? And persuasion is a completely different type of writing. And then third, the last category is, are we just trying to inform someone about something? We see a lot of VR pieces that are meant to educate people about a certain topic. We especially see a lot of 360 video that is created, that is 360 journalism. That's wonderful. A lot of great storytelling. The New York Times has done some incredible pieces, but it's purely meant to inform us about an issue that's going on in the world. So establishing it right up front, is my piece meant to entertain, persuade, or inform, is a great first step when you're beginning to experiment with writing something for virtual reality. The second tip I'd like to move to is probably my favorite, if not one of the most important. And this is that stories really revolve around the idea of characters, conflict, and goal. So the first thing that we have to do in VR is we have to determine who the key characters are going to be. Now, typically, in storytelling, we determine a protagonist first. This is the person we're going to follow on the journey. Now, of course, in VR, we have some options that we typically don't have in other mediums, because while the audience can watch and follow the story of a protagonist, in VR, we have the opportunity to actually make the participant the protagonist. And this is a different type of storytelling, to hand the agency over to the protagonist and allow them to make decisions that will impact the story. Now, the audience needs to know, the participants in the experience need to know right up front if they are the protagonist or if they're merely observing the journey of another protagonist as a third party. There's several ways that we can establish this and help the participant really identify either their place in this world or the place of the character they're going to most closely follow. Some of the techniques we use to do that are position, for example. Are we the protagonist, or have we positioned the protagonist in the space in such a way that the audience and participants can most easily follow that character? Second is our use of light. The human eye tends to gravitate towards the most brightly lit thing in the room. And so using this to guide viewers' eyes towards certain positions, towards certain characters, can be very important in helping people to identify who it is that we're really tracking on this journey. The third thing that we use is dialogue. We have to be able to very selectively and carefully use dialogue, especially in a VR experience, if characters are going to speak to the audience as protagonist, or if the audience and participants are examining the dialogue between different characters. We have to be cautious about this, because it's very easy to set up stories where the characters on screen are explaining the plot of the experience to each other for our benefit. And this is very boring. This becomes very uninteresting. We're working in VR with a very visual medium. So visual storytelling becomes very important as we try and craft narrative in this space. The second thing that we need to be able to determine is some sort of conflict in the experience, some sort of antagonistic force. There's been many story theorists that say this is so key to storytelling because it works in conjunction with how the human brain solves problems. So having an antagonistic force, knowing that there's some conflict that must be overcome, this is quite important to the psychology of the participant if they're going to really engage into this world. Now, this antagonistic force may come in the form of a character who is opposing the protagonist. This antagonistic force may come in the form of some sort of weather event, like a tornado or a cyclone, or, some sort of force that is keeping the protagonist from getting where they need to go on their journey. There's a great number of different antagonistic forces that we can employ in a VR experience in order to set up conflict for whoever's acting as the protagonist, be that the participant in the experience or be a third party that we're observing.
Quick question. Going back to determine a protagonist, you mentioned position, light, and dialogue. What about audio, sound effects, specifically more spatialized?
Absolutely. I think audio is maybe the most important and misunderstood concept in storytelling for virtual reality. I think it's so important. It's literally 50% of the experience the audience is having. Actually, in a later point, I'm going to specifically address audio, so I'll save some of what I have to say for that. But yeah, I think audio is such a key element of storytelling in virtual reality.
Cool, and then we'll wait for those. Thanks.
The other thing that I think we do have to establish for the participant in the experience is, what are the rules of this world? What can I do and what can I not do in this experience? We certainly can allow some degree of experimentation for the participant in the experience to try certain things, and that can be part of the fun of the experience. But if a participant literally has to spend all of their time just trying things in order to figure out the rules of the world, it becomes very hard to engage them in narrative. It becomes very hard to begin to take them on a story journey if we have them spend all their time just trying to find the rules of the world. Now, establishing the rules of the world in any story can be a very difficult and time-consuming thing. This is one reason in some of my favorite films, actually, everything from Star Wars to Lord of the Rings, we have a prologue that's actually text that explains the rules of the world in order to quickly get us into the storytelling so the audience doesn't have to learn a lot about what's going on in this world. Now, I'm not saying a text prologue is always the best thing for VR, but I do think we have to very quickly establish for the participant, are the rules of this world similar to the rules of the world we live in? Are there different things? Do we have magical powers? Are we able to transcend space and time? What are the elements that will allow me to psychologically engage with the narrative that I'm going to experience in this world? The last part of this tip is that I think it's important to determine for whoever is the protagonist, be it the participant in the experience or a third party, what is the external goal? What do we want to do in this experience? What do we want to accomplish in this experience? Or what do I want to see the main character do or accomplish? It should be something that we could take a picture of and know when it has been completed. Now, this is, of course, different than like sandbox experiences that I'll talk about briefly a little later. But in a narrative-based experience, we want to determine some sort of external goal so that we can see the protagonist actually accomplish something. Bonus points if you can incorporate an internal goal that actually develops the character. Here's the difference between an external and an internal goal. Maybe our external goal is to find the buried treasure in this hidden cave. The internal goal may actually be to feel connected to the world or to find love in the process. But the internal goal is something that happens within a character, while the external goal is something we can take a picture of. It's an actual physical task that must occur in order for the experience to be complete. Moving on to the third tip. I believe that resolution is maybe the thing we have figured out the least in virtual reality experiences. We have really, I think, gotten good at providing the participant an engaging and interesting experience as soon as they enter the world. We've given them some fun things to do in the VR space. However, we really don't have a lot of experiences that do a good job at completing the experience. And if we're going to work in this arena of narrative-based experiences, we want a completion. We want the participant to know, okay, the experience, what I've come here to do, what the main character, which is either me or a character I'm watching, they've accomplished what they've come here to accomplish. I compare this to music or poetry, and that we need the music to resolve in order for the audience to feel an emotional experience. And this is something that I think we should ask ourselves with every VR experience. Is there an emotional resolution as well as a mental one? Is there some sense of satisfaction as we complete the experience, as we finish the experience? Is there some sense that the story is finished? I'll talk in just a moment about how we structure something like that, but asking ourselves, do I have a resolution that the participant really feels like, okay, I've come here and done what I came to do? Because we're still figuring out the ideal length for a VR experience, this can be very difficult. However, I think many of us really understand that people are not willing, at this point at least, to spend 2.5 hours inside of one singular VR experience that's narrative based. The sweet spot right now I'm seeing is really 15 minutes or less. Actually, the shorter, the better, if we have a powerful emotional resolution at the end of that experience. I would point people to experiences such as Dear Angelica that Oculus released as an example of an experience that has a great emotional resolution at the end of the experience. We know when that experience is complete.
If you don't mind, I'll jump in and add one more. The Great Sea is another good one that was just recently released. Visually stunning, story is great, audio is amazing, very immersive, so highly recommend that. And I do agree with you that long experiences, I think it just becomes mentally and literally physically exhausting because of VR.
Yeah.
What's your thought on the passive versus more interactive?
I have a dear friend that actually wrote the foreword to my book that addresses this better than I can. And his theory is that it really depends on who your audience is if you're determining to lean more passive or interactive. His theory is that for experiences created for, say, college age and under, that is a group of people that every day they go to school, they're being told what to do, go to this class, go to that class, do your homework, do this, do that. And they're not allowed any agency in their lives at all during the day. So when they get home, all they want are experiences that allow them agency. They want the ability to make decisions. Now, I'm guessing men of a certain age, like myself and yourself, we spend all our day as adults making decisions that when I get home, sometimes I really don't want to make any more decisions. I don't want a great deal of agency. I want a more passive experience because I've been making decisions and having agency all day. So I think looking at the psychology of the audience that you're designing the experience for is very important. And again, that's not my idea. That's Ted Schilowitz, who's the futurist at Paramount Pictures. But I think he's really onto something with that. I think there's a great deal we can learn about thinking through who is the core audience I'm designing the experience for.
Definitely. And going back to length of the experience, I think when you have a lot of agency and a lot of interactivity, people are willing to stay in there longer. But when it's passive, I think people are not willing to stay there as long.
I completely agree. I think that's exactly right. I really also enjoy The Great Sea that you mentioned as a passive experience, but because it's so visually stunning, I'm probably willing to stay in that world and with that narrative experience longer than I would most. Also, they're working with the great advantage of telling a story by a very well-known storyteller, Philip K. Dick, that many of us will set through that experience as long as we need to in order to see how Philip K. Dick resolved that storyline. So I think if you find the right material, if you are working with IP, you very well may have the ability to create a longer experience if your audience already has some sort of emotional connection to the material. But if you're creating original material, original IP, you probably do want to keep that as short as possible just because people may not be willing to give it as much of a chance that they would a lengthy experience.
Definitely. Thank you.
So moving on to the fourth tip, I do think it's important to lean into passive engagement even when we're creating an experience that has a great deal of agency. Now, what do I mean by this? What I'm really talking about is what we call environmental storytelling. So I think if you're writing for VR, VR and you're trying to craft descriptions of what is happening in the world, this VR world you're creating, I think learning a little bit about color theory can be very helpful. Learning what sorts of colors cause certain emotional reactions in the participant, very, very helpful. I talk about this in my book, and there's a number of other books that have been written about how we execute different colors in order to create emotional experiences in the part of the audience. So learning a bit about that, I think, can be very helpful. It's not something that the audience is necessarily going to have any agency in or choose, but even with an experience where there's a great degree of agency, affecting the color that's used when you're writing an experience can be very significant. I also think it's helpful to learn a bit about symbolism. There are tremendous works that have been created about how we use symbols in visual media in order to help the audience piece together narratives. Some of these things are universal symbols that people recognize, and some of these things are symbols that we endow with meaning. Certain experiences can lean into things people already are familiar with. I'll give you an example. If anyone ever saw the movie The Iron Giant, there's a motif that appears 3 times in The Iron Giant around Superman. And the first time we see the Superman motif, it symbolizes what the Iron Giant is aspiring to be. The second time we see the Superman motif in The Iron Giant, it is the Iron Giant failing to live up to what he aspired to be, failing to be like Superman. And then the third time we see that motif, we see the Iron Giant succeed at actually using that symbol and that motif and being like Superman. So that's an example of a motif people are already familiar with. We know the Superman symbol. We know what it means. We know what it symbolizes. However, we can also take something as simple as a candle or a lamp and endow it with a great deal of meaning for what it is supposed to represent in our story. And this engages the audience on a much deeper level. It sometimes engages the audience on a subconscious level even, because our brain is piecing together meaning while we are consciously participating in the active aspects of the experience and using our own agency. I think this is the most exciting type of VR storytelling because it allows participants to be creating something, doing something within the VR space, and at the same time, under the surface, their subconscious is trying to create meaning and piecing together what these various symbols mean. The symbols may or may not be a part of the actual plot of the narrative experience. They may just be something that we see on the wall. I consulted with a group that was creating an experience that was based around a mystery, a detective mystery, and they had put various items and issues on the wall that were notes the detective had put to himself up there. And one of the things I advised them to do was to actually use and take advantage of these notes that the detective had put on the wall to incorporate symbols and motifs and themes and ideas that when the participant in the experience went over and read these notes that were on the wall, they actually had some substance to them. They weren't just throwaway things in the experience that had no narrative significance. The last idea for passive engagement is something that you referenced earlier, and I think it's so important, and that is using sound to help guide the narrative experience for the audience. Most of us know that music can be very powerful emotionally. However, it's interesting when we look at how sound can be used to guide the experience of a user and even to direct their attention to things that we want them to engage with. For example, if I hear a loud sound right now behind me in my office where I'm sitting talking to you, I'm going to immediately turn around and see what that loud sound was. It will direct my attention for me. So I think we can get beyond the idea of just using the volume of a sound in order to guide the user's experience experience, but I think we can also use different types of sound that draw in a user's experience. For example, when we hear even very quietly two people having a conversation, our brain begins to try and construct meaning around that conversation. We begin to try and listen to what those people are saying. And if we're in an experience, we can move closer to what those people were saying so we can hear them better. We typically will do that. I think where that can get interesting narratively is the participant has to know, am I going to be seen in this experience if I move closer to that conversation? Am I trying to not be seen moving closer? Am I trying to eavesdrop on that conversation? Or am I a ghost in the room that can easily go over and listen in on this conversation that is being had without any sort of consequences? This kind of goes back to the previous tip we talked about, where the audience or the participant really has to understand their role in the experience. Our fifth and final tip deals with embracing form over formula. I think when many people hear someone trying to talk about writing for virtual reality, they get very nervous that there's going to be some sort of formula or structure that's going to be presented that is going to box in their creativity. And I can tell you that the last thing I'm interested in doing is trying to communicate a formula that it has to be this way. As I mentioned right from the beginning, we have to experiment in order to determine how to tell stories in this medium. However, I do believe we can embrace form over formula. I see it often like dancing. When you are learning to dance or play a musical instrument, you learn the notes, you learn the steps, but really after some time, you're going to try and develop a rhythm and a creativity within that space that you transcend the form that you've learned. But we would never imagine designing a home that didn't have a blueprint first, that didn't have a structure to it that we're adhering to. Now, does that mean just because every home has floors, a ceiling, doors, windows, does that mean every home looks alike? Absolutely not. But I do believe, especially when we're first starting out and learning to tell stories in VR, we would do well to lean into what's called an Aristotelian form. This is the idea that Aristotle gave us, which is why it's called an Aristotelian form. And Aristotle suggested that stories should have a beginning, a middle, and an end. In film and television, we call this three-act structure. We may or may not use three-act structure in the experience that we're developing. However, I do believe it's helpful when we're first designing an experience to think of the experience in terms of a beginning, a middle, and an end as three buckets to begin to drop things into, even if later we end up scrapping those things. Now, I'm not going to go deep into this, but in my book, I talk about interactive three-act structure and interactive five-act structure, which are two different approaches you can use when the audience has agency and we're not just creating a passive experience. Both of those structures basically suggest that at the end of each act, or three times during a beginning, middle, end experience, or potentially even five times in the experience, the participant has a major bit of agency or interaction that they are able to affect the story with. If the participant can affect every aspect of the story completely, it quickly becomes a sandbox experience, and that's fine. Those are fun. Those are wonderful. But they really take us out of the realm of a narrative experience. Now, that said, I do present a theory in my book, what I call the narrative shards theory. And that is, even if we're creating a sandbox experience or an experience that is not meant to be purely narrative in nature, we can take elements from storytelling, character, conflict, the way that environments are designed to create narrative feelings in the audience. We can take these small elements and still incorporate them into experiences that are not necessarily meant to be traditionally structured into a beginning, middle, and end experience. And narrative shards can be very helpful. I imagine all the perfect elements of storytelling being contained in a beautiful vase, and that vase being dropped dropped on the floor, broken into a million pieces, and all those perfect elements of storytelling being within these shards that are on the floor. And we can take these shards and we can take which ones that might work in our experience, be it just maybe character or just color or sound, and we can then take the shards and create a new mosaic that creates something completely different that may be non-linear or non-traditional in structure, but it's still taking story elements in order to craft something that the participant engages in on a narrative level. Now, before I conclude, I did want to give just a couple of examples for people to see of ways that these things get executed. The first example here I'm showing is a storyboard that was created by Vincent McCurley. And Vincent has this approach where he basically creates elements that the audience will experience narratively by placing the participant in the center of the experience. And you can hopefully see different fields of view identified for the participant as far as what the participant will most actively engage in being right in front of them. And then the peripheral parts of the experience in a darker shade of gray. And then what is behind the participant, they can certainly turn around and see, but not spending too much mental energy on narrative when it comes to things that the participant may or may not ever even engage in. A second approach here is Andrew Leach's approach, and Andrew has taken a slightly different approach to this, where he is designing his experience narratively based on the way that people are looking through the viewer, as you can see with the storyboards he's designed here, and taking each one of the narrative beats in the story and putting them in some sort of field of view. And by the way, I have at the bottom of the screen, his work in these storyboards are available at betaville.com, which is Andrew's website. And he's doing really incredible and exciting things with narrative in VR. I also do want to show a sample page from the Screenplay Slam by the two creators listed at the bottom of the screen. Several people have pointed to this as a great approach in VR. You can see that we actually have the words or the story in paragraph form over on the left-hand side of the screen. And then over on the right-hand side of the screen, we're talking about the different quadrants that the audience is seeing, and then using color coding in order to connect those quadrants to what the audience is seeing. This is yet another approach, and I've seen it be quite effective in how creators will engage it. It's interesting to me that we have all these different approaches right now. You can also download Yvette Vargas's template for how she approaches writing for a VR experience at finaldraft.com. And all of these are different ways of looking at how to create story within VR or writing for VR. None of them are wrong. None of them are the exact right one. We're having different creators right now saying, here's what's working for me. And I think as we begin writing for VR, that's what we have to do, is go and look and see what is working for people. If you're interested in these ideas, I go into a ton more detail in my book, which is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and through Routledge's website. My book is called Storytelling for Virtual Reality. It not only features the methods and techniques for creating and writing stories in virtual reality, a significant portion of the book are interviews with various creators who I believe are the people at the very top of the game of VR storytelling. People like Chris Milk, people like Rob Breedlove at Industrial Light and Magic's X Lab. There's just a number of different creators who were happy to share their expertise and experience in interviews in the book. I also interview members of the immersive theater community talking about what they've learned over the last 20 years with immersive theater and how those principles can be used in VR. So there's just a wide selection of things that you may find helpful to storytelling in virtual reality in the book. I would really love to say thank you so much for having me be a guest, and being able to present this lecture was a real treat for me. So thanks so much for allowing me to present this talk, and people that are wanting to contact me or get a hold of me, feel free to follow me on Twitter. I often am tweeting about storytelling for virtual reality. My Twitter handle is John, JOHN, KBUCHER. Or you can find out more about me and my work at my website, which is tellingabetterstory.com.
Awesome job, John. Thank you so much. It's been fun. It's been very educational personally for me. Some great tips here. So thank you so much for doing this. And I know you're going to be in my meetup in November. So if anybody's in Southern California and they want to see John in person doing another great presentation like this, please join us.
Very excited about that. So honored to be doing that. And if you're in Southern California, please come out and join us for that meetup. I'll be giving a completely different talk than what I did today.
Always a pleasure listening to you and your wealth of information, John. So thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you to the rest of you for joining me here today. Just a quick reminder, if you want more video tutorials just like this one, assets to practice with, podcast interviews, plus much more, make sure to register for free at howtocreatevr.com. Also, if you are ever in the Southern California area, we have a monthly meetup with lots of great VR, AR, and MR presentations. You can join or RSVP for our next meetup at howtocreatevr.com/meetup. So until the next episode, I'm Marcelo Lewin. Cheers, everyone.